Um, so last week we began with a little bit of an introduction to the first word, which I hoped was a chance for us to, opportunity for us to kind of learn how we can see these as a whole. I know there's some confusion sometimes for Christians about how we view the law. And so one of the things we said last week is that even though as Christians we are not under the law anymore because we are under grace, that still what we see happening in the New Testament is the authors picking up the kind of moral aspects of the Old Covenant or the Old Law and suggesting that these apply to us today, which means that as Christians we still should care about and obey these 10 words that have been so foundational for Western society throughout the ages. Really, this is one of the most important pieces of law ever given that has shaped much of the world that we know and live in today. And so today, we're going to be getting into the first word, so the very first word or commandment, and exploring that. So let's read that together from Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 3. Exodus 20, 1 to 3. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. This is the first word. One of the fascinating storylines I think that has emerged in our secular world today is the idea that ours is a world or a culture that is highly irreligious. Have you guys heard that before? Terms like that thrown out. Stats tell us that church attendance is declining, that less and less people read their Bible and pray, less and less people believe in God, more and more believe that Jesus was just an excellent teacher, a good moral teacher, but that he's not actually the Son of God. So these are all things that we hear today, and people will make the claim that therefore we are highly irreligious. So we could look at something like this first word, which speaks about the necessity of worshiping God alone, and think that that seems out of touch for our world today. Right? We might think that the issue for our world is not that they worship too many gods, but rather they don't worship at all. And of course, at one level, we might say that's correct, right? At one level, when we think about traditional religious forms and structures and church attendance and kind of traditional religions like that, we might say, true, there is a sense in which that is decreasing. Although I will say, a disclaimer, that is just generally in the West, not globally. Globally, Christianity is exploding. It's part of the narrative that we don't hear very often. And even in the West, it's probably not as dramatic as many people make it out to be. But yes, we could say it's true. By some of those stats, it might seem like religion is going down. And yet, on the other hand, I hope that you'll come to see with me today that even though that's how the discussion has been framed, that it doesn't take the entire picture into account. I want to argue that even though traditional religions might be seen as declining, that on the whole, even in the Western world, even in Canada today, our world is as religious as it's ever been. It has just taken on different shapes and different forms in 2021. Now, before we get into this, a really quick recap about what we said about these 10 words last week. Remember, I suggested we should view these 10 words as words, first of all, that reveal both who God is and who we are. We should view these words as words of new creation, because in these words, God is laying out the path to human flourishing. He's giving us directions to where true, abundant life can be found. And then finally, we should view these words as words of grace, because they are commands given to us in response to salvation that has already been accomplished. Right? God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. He already rescued his people, and then he gives them these commands, these rules to walk in as a response to grace. And it's the same with the Christian life. We obey not to earn God's favor, but because he's already shown it to us. And therefore, our response is one of love because of God's grace shown to us. And so here's what I want to do this morning. I want to look at this first word and talk about what it is. And then I want to talk about what it isn't, actually, and what's missing from this first word that we might expect to be there, and then what that means for us today and how we attempt to follow Jesus in our world and to have no other gods before the triune God that we worship. So that's kind of a rough structure. Now, before we look exactly at what it is, I want you to notice again, first of all, the way that the first word is connected to the Exodus event. So look with me again at verse 1 and 2. It says, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So in some ways, the Exodus event forms the background for all of the 10 words, but in many ways, it especially is connected to this first one. This command to have no other gods before the God is intimately tied to the fact that God has rescued Israel from the house of slavery, from the nation of Egypt. And I want to show you what I mean by that. What we see happening in the plagues actually is not just that God is demonstrating his great power and saying to all the people, like, here are some cool things that I can do. Watch what I can do. See how powerful I am. Much more than that, what we see God doing is intentionally deconstructing and dismantling the gods that the Egyptians would have worshipped. And so in many ways, what we see God doing is highlighting his power over the false gods of Egypt. And so, for example, when we read in Exodus 12, verse 12, when God is giving Moses instructions for how to prepare for the final plague, the death of the firstborn son, he describes this action like this. He says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast." And listen to this, "and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments." So think about that with me for a second. God is saying that part of his judgment will not just be over the nation of Egypt and over Pharaoh, but also over all of the false gods that they worship. And so, for example, we don't have time to walk through all of these, but the first plague involved turning the water in the Nile River to blood, right? And in ancient Egypt, the Nile was a crucial part of their life, not only for their flourishing and for the economy, but was also often worshipped as a god. The Nile had become kind of personified as a god that they would worship. And so when God, in his first plague, takes that life-giving water and turns it into blood, he is essentially undermining this God of life that they would have worshipped. Another example, we could look at the ninth plague, which was darkness covering the land for 3 days. And it says that it was so dark that no one could leave their place for the duration of that time. And yet there was light where Israel was. So again, one of the most powerful gods worshipped by ancient Egyptians was the sun god Re. And so God's saying, no, there is only one person who has power here, and that is the God of Israel. He's demonstrating not only to Egypt, but also to his people that he is the true and only God. So you think that the sun god is control of the sun. Well, I'm going to dismantle that for you by showing that I have complete power over light and darkness. And where I want there to be darkness, there will be darkness. And where I want there to be light, there will be light, right? So again and again, we see God just undermining the authority of these false gods. Listen to how a Jewish scholar, Nahum Sarna, puts it like this. He says, the inability of the magicians to reproduce the plagues after a while. Remember, they were trying to reproduce the plagues. And then he says also the transcendent ability of God to manipulate nature in order to realize his purposes, and the protection from the effects of the plagues that he bestows upon Israel, all are calculated to undermine faith in what the Egyptians accepted as divinities. So in the introduction to the 10 words, when God says, I am the God who rescued you from Egypt, he's reminding the people of Israel of all the ways that he demonstrated before their eyes that he is the only true God, the only God worthy of worship, the only God who's powerful. And he's putting before their minds the way he completely dismantled the false gods of Egypt. And if we're honest, like what we see happening is not even really a battle going on, right? It's not even like we see a battle between God and these other false gods, and then in the end, God emerges as victorious. What we see is just that there really is truly only one God who is powerful. There is no competition there. There's no question for anyone who would see this, whether or not, these other gods were the true God. There's one true creator God who reveals himself through these things. And so with that background then, remember, these Israelites would have just been rescued, so all these plagues and these events would have been fresh in their minds, and God reminds them of that. And then he speaks this first word, you shall have no other gods before me. He's rescued his people. He's established his covenant with them. And now he's speaking them directly, these 10 words that will form the moral bedrock of their obligation before God. And the first thing he says is that they should have no other gods, right? They were just immersed in a polytheistic culture in Egypt, and they're going into another polytheistic culture in Canaan. And God is saying, in a world where every other nation worships a plethora or multiple gods, the people of God are to be distinct in that they should have no other gods before Yahweh. Now, at this point, there's some debate about what is actually meant in this first word or this first commandment, right? Is God just asking to be first among many? Right, when it says, you shall have no other gods before me, is the point of that God just saying, you can have other gods, but I've just got to be first place. There can be other people in the picture, but as long as I rank above that, as long as you've got me in the lead, then everything is okay? Or is God saying, I must be worshipped alone? But what we see in this statement is not just that God is concerned about his rank, He is, in some sense, he needs to be first, but also he's concerned about proximity. Literally, the text could read like this: "You shall have no other gods in my presence, no other gods before my face." There is no one else who is to be around. Essentially, God is saying, there is no one else, therefore you shall worship no one else. And the rest of the scripture makes it clear that God is to be worshiped alone because he is God alone. I love Isaiah 45, verse 5. God makes it really clear. He says, "I am the Lord and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God." And again, 45 verse 18, he says, "I am the Lord and there is no other." Right? God is making it clear to his people that it's not that he's just kind of risen to the top. He's saying there is no one else. There was no one else like our God. He is God alone. There's no one else beside him. And therefore, because that is true of him, he is not to be worshipped as the best of many, but he is to be worshipped alone as supreme and as good and as creator, which means that God is calling for all of the worship of all of his people, and he will not share it with anyone else. Now, what I want you to see is that because this first word is commanding our complete allegiance to God alone and nothing else, this word really becomes foundational for the rest of the 10 words. It's not that the other ones aren't important, but in many ways we could look at it and say this: if this first word isn't here, then there is really no reason for us to obey the other 9. If this first word does not exist, then there really becomes no obligation for us to the rest. Here's what I mean by that. Because if there is not one true God, if God is not the supreme being over everything else, then why obey these rules and not some other set of rules? Right? If it's not true that there is only one God and he is the creator of everything, then why should we assume that we should listen to these 9 other words? Why would we not listen to words that relate to ourselves and what we want and what we desire and what makes sense for us? And I want to suggest to you, pay attention here, this is important, that many of the struggles Christians are having and will continue to have and increasingly have as we engage with the world around us, at the end of the day, come down to the essence of this first word in Exodus 20, verse 3. We might think that the challenge that we have with our world is around things like sexuality, around things like gender, around things like the sanctity of life, and certainly those are real issues. But what's really going on at the bottom, underneath all of those things, it comes down to this. At a deeper level, the disconnect between us and our world ultimately lies right here, because we believe, as followers of Jesus, that there is a loving, supreme, creator, triune God from whom all things exist, by whom and for whom we were created. And therefore, because we were created by him and for him, he has the right to hold us accountable to that, doesn't he? He has the right as our creator to call us to live in a certain way. That's what we believe. But if that foundation is not there, then all of the morality and ethics that our world has built up on that foundation slowly begin to crumble as well. And really, this is what we're seeing happening in our world today. Many of you, any fans of philosophy here? Many of you will be familiar, even if you're not a fan, with the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. You guys know that name? Nietzsche was famous for being highly critical. That's an understatement, really, of Christianity. And we'll know him as a philosopher, again, from the late 1800s, who said that God is dead, right? That he claimed that God is now dead, that humanity has killed God. They've erased him from the picture. But what we often don't know about Nietzsche is that his goal was not just to eliminate the concept of God or the idea of God, but also to compel our world to live consistently with the implications of that reality. So one of the things that Nietzsche wanted to do was to say, listen, if God is dead, then it means that there is no basis for morality anymore. There is no basis for ethics. There is no reason for you to feel guilty. There is no reason for you to wonder about what is wrong and right, because he is out of the picture. All of the structure that was built up on the fact that there is a God exists now needs to crumble and now needs to be eliminated. You can't consistently hold to the moral structures that arose from the existence of a transcendent God if you remove God from that picture. That was his point. And what we're seeing today is essentially the outworking of this idea. It's taken some time, hasn't it? But it is true that when transcendent, creator, loving God is eliminated from the picture, the only thing left with which we can build some framework is our own selves and what we deem to be good for us. And this is the path that we have chosen as a world today. And what this means for all of us, whether you're here and you're a follower of Jesus, or you're just with us exploring Christianity or curious about what's going on here, all of us at some level have to come to terms with this first word: you shall have no other gods before me. Who will have authority to tell you how to live? I want you to think about that question. Who will have the authority to tell you how to live? Our world says that basically that authority resides within yourself. That the only sure way for you to discern what is right and wrong, the only firm ground that you have to make judgments about what to do, how to live, is within you. And the Bible tells us that authority belongs to God and to God alone. The question that we need to answer is, who will we trust? Who will we trust? Now, with that being said, I want you to pay attention to something that we don't see in this first word. Okay, so positively, if we see that this first word is a command to allegiance to God and to God alone, I want you to see what is missing here. Namely, there's something that's implied or assumed in this first word. Let me put it this way. The 10 words do not contain a command to worship. Think about this with me. Yes, the first word will tell us who we must worship, and others will speak to how we must worship, but the fact that humans will worship is implied in this statement, right? The fact that we will be worshipful beings is implied, right? God is not saying you must worship. He's saying, don't worship these other gods, but worship me. Allegiance to me alone. Now, what does that mean for us? Let me highlight two things for you. One of the things this means is that everyone you will meet on the streets, your neighbors, friends, co-workers, at some level is a worshiping being. I'm not saying that they'd identify as religious necessarily, but I'm saying that they are a worship being whether they recognize it or not. So whether they're Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, this New Age spirituality, or they're atheist, all of these individuals are inherently worshipful. We cling to the things that we think provide a framework for how to think about the world, and we give ourselves over to those things that at some level provide us meaning and value and security. David Foster Wallace is a famous author. He was a famous author. He put it like this in a commencement address to college students. He says, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping, he says. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. Isn't that interesting? Now, I think his point is not to suggest that people who are atheists are lying or they're being dishonest or anything like that. His point is that whether you think there is a God or not, your life will be marked by the worship of something. Your heart will cling to something as ultimate, and therefore your life will be oriented and directed towards that thing that you've come to love and cherish and find all of your meaning and your value in. So that's the first thing. Everyone we meet is a worshiping being. But then the second thing this means is that in a world that is corrupted by sin, our worship will therefore be corrupted. So remember, we've said that these words are words that reveal. They reveal who God is and they reveal who we are. And so in the first word, we're seeing that God is the only true God, but then it also reveals who we are, that we are a people that God needs to tell us not to worship idols, to have no other gods before him. It says something about us, something crucial about us. And here's what I want us to see. The problem for us is not that we will cease to worship. Right? Like the issue is not that we will kind of stop finding things to love and finding things to chase after and giving our lives over to. Rather, the issue is that we will do that for all of the wrong things and we will have worship that is misdirected. And so in the first word, God is saying, yes, you will be worshiping beings, but you shall have no other gods before me. Your worship should be directed towards me and me alone. We need to be redirected in our worship so that the object becomes what it ought to be. One of my favorite stories from the book of Acts is that when Paul is in Athens and he's walking around the city, and it says that his spirit was provoked within him. You guys remember the story? His spirit was provoked within him because he saw that the city was full of idols. And later on when he addresses them, he says, men of Athens, I perceive that you are very religious because as I walked around your city, I saw that it was full of idols. And then he says this, I even saw an idol with this inscription, to the unknown God. Right, so Paul is saying these guys were so religious, so worshipful, we could say, so religious that their city was full of different idols that they had created, and so much so that they even created an idol to a God that they didn't even know if he existed, as if this was kind of like a Hail Mary. In case we missed anyone, we want to create an idol to that God that we missed, that we don't even know. And the reality is that in 2021, we are very much like the people of Athens, aren't we? We've got gods all over the place, on billboards, within our homes, on our smartphones, our workplaces, families. We are very highly religious people who have created all sorts of different things that we can worship. And the first word says to us that God, being unrivaled by any other God, should also be unrivaled in our hearts. In other words, the space he occupies in our hearts is not to be shared with anyone else. Our allegiance is not to be divided between God and something else. But when we fall prey to idolatrous worship, this is what we are doing, in essence. We are bringing other gods into the space where God alone should be. And when other gods are in the space where God alone should be, the voices of those other gods begin to beckon us to build our lives around them and to give them access to the throne of our hearts. So it's not only that we are worshiping false gods, but it's also that these gods then begin to call for our attention and redirect us towards their purposes and towards what they would have rather than what God would want with our lives. Now, I know many of us are familiar with this concept, but I want to press in on this a little bit and answer this question. How do we know when something's become an idol in our heart or in our life? Right? Because oftentimes, idols are good things that have become ultimate, that are misplaced, right? Good gifts from God that maybe we give weight to that are not, and they're not intended to hold. And I'm guessing today, not many of you have, statues in your basement or little shrines set up that you bow down to in the morning and pray to. And so they're less obvious for us in many ways, and yet they're no less present. So how do we discern what those are? How do we know what those are in our lives? Martin Luther said it like this. He said, "Whatever your heart clings to and confides in, that is really your God." Whatever your heart clings to and confides in, that is really your God. I like also how Tim Keller defined it. He said, an idol is whatever you look at and say, in your heart of hearts, if I have that, then I'll feel that my life has meaning. Then I'll know I have value. Then I'll feel significant and secure. I think both of these are great definitions. And if those are true, if idols are things that our hearts cling to, and whatever we think gives our life meaning and value, then it means that one of the ways I think we can identify idols is by the response that we have when those things are taken away from us. So let me ask you this question. What is it in your life that when it gets taken away or threatened, it throws your whole world or your whole life into a sort of tailspin? You know what I'm talking about, right? Ever been there where you're up late at night, can't sleep because your mind is just playing over a situation again and again and again, and you're wrestling with it, you're trying to let it go, and that you're just fixated, disturbed on this one thing. What is that thing in your life that keeps you up at night? Because the reality is we've got to learn to be attentive to moments and emotions like these, because chances are if you begin to trace those feelings, if you begin to kind of chase that anger, that frustration, that discontent, and find out what's underneath all of that, most likely what you're going to find is an idol that has been left unchecked in your heart for years and years and years, that has led to a point that when that gets disrupted, your whole world feels like it's been turned upside down, and you get frustrated and you get angry with other people. You feel like you're being threatened and you don't know who you really are anymore, because what you've ultimately done is made that thing your God. So maybe this morning that could be a number of different things. Maybe if you're honest, you find yourself riding the highs and lows of the stock market. Things look good and you feel like your life is joyful, right? Financially, things are going well and you feel complete. You feel like you can be engaged with the world and loving others. And yet, on the other hand, when things go down, when your financial future is not looking so good, things begin to crumble. You feel insecure. You wonder what the point of everything is. You wonder who you really are. You're angry with your spouse and your kids because your security has been threatened. Right? And maybe it's not even money. Maybe it's the comfort that money provides, or the lifestyle, the luxury that money provides. But all of these things are idols that our heart clings to. Maybe for you it's a relationship. Either one that you have currently or one that you do not yet have, or one that you hope you'll have. And that relationship, a future or present, has come to mean so much to you that if somehow it were ended or not, you were not able to get that, your life would crumble. You wouldn't know how you would survive, or you wouldn't understand who you would really be without that person. Likely that would be an idol as well. Maybe you feel that way when you look in the mirror or see a number on a scale. And so your life feels like it's either progressing or crumbling on the basis of how well you feel you are achieving the image of yourself that you want to show to the world. One of the things I've noticed, just being really honest in my own life, is that I struggle with people pleasing. Anyone else like that? wanting to have everyone be happy with me. And so what happens is that when that doesn't happen, which is often, right, if we're honest, when that doesn't happen, when there's criticism that feels unfair, or even when there's criticism that's legitimate, I can feel the turbulence of that deep within my heart and find myself often up late at night just wrestling over things that people have said. How could they say that? How could they say, don't they know, going on, wrestling in my mind, when in reality, at the end of the day, God will often graciously just remind me that I've made an idol out of being liked by people or pleasing everyone or wanting there to be no conflict. And here's the thing about all of these idols. We could think that they're harmless for the most part, but when our hearts cling to and attach themselves to these things to give us meaning, again, they begin to call the shots, don't they? They begin to call the shots in our lives. They become gods not only that we worship them, but we obey the instincts that come from them. What do I mean? Well, my life can't be governed both by how God says I should live and what and by my desire to please people. Isn't that true? My life can't be both governed by my desire for money and comfort and luxury and by how God reveals that I should live with generosity and by giving away and by not collecting treasures on earth. Right? My life can't be governed by those two things. One of those things is going to win out in the end. And often when we give ourselves over to these idols, it is their voice that we end up listening to and ignoring the voice of the one true God. We could go on and on. Now, it's one thing this morning for us to learn to identify those things, right? That's the easy part in some ways. They're everywhere in our hearts. I'm sure you guys all know what those are. But the real challenge that we face is how do we eliminate idols from our lives? How do we cease worshiping false gods and begin to worship the one true God? How do we walk in obedience to the first word? And this morning I want to introduce you to an idea or a concept that's been quite transformative for me over the years, and I pray will be a blessing to you as you think about these things. I want to talk to you about the expulsive power of a new affection. Thomas Chalmers was a Scottish minister and professor who lived from the late 18th to early 19th century. And he was a brilliant man, pastor and scholar. But he wrote a sermon that's become quite famous and influential to this day called The Expulsive Power of a New Affection. And this sermon really was a reflection on the text of 1 John 2:10, which says this. Let me read it. It says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever." So 1 John in many ways is mentioning, without explicitly stating it, the issue of idolatry, right? What is idolatry other than things that our heart, things of the world that our heart has come to love? And what Chalmers does in his sermon is he says, as we think about loving the world or loving idols, there's really two ways that we could approach eliminating idols from our life. The first way is to focus on the unworthiness of the idols themselves. So we could look at our life and say, man, money is just not a worthy thing to live for. Right? It's going to let us down in the end, and so I shouldn't make my life all about that. Or we could take another example and say, you should not live your life to please people. That is a poor way to live. That's an unworthy object of your affection, so don't give yourselves over to that. We could say the same thing about our career. We could focus on our career and say, you know what? At the end of the line, I could do all these things in my career, and someone else is going to come along who's better than me and take over, and I will be forgotten one day. So I should not make my life all about my career. That's one way that we could approach eradicating idols from our lives. And I would argue that there's a place for that. There's a place for that. But what Chalmers goes on to say is that this is really an ineffective way. It's an ineffective way of actually doing what we want to accomplish, because the reality is that we are worshiping beings. We are created to love and to long for and to worship. And so we could try to get rid of idols by eliminating them and by pulling them out. But the reality is that we can't have a vacuum in our hearts. Something else is going to replace it. So we might focus on money and say, I'm not going to love that, but then some other thing, pride, and some other thing is going to take its place because it can't be empty. Chalmers, he said it like this. Pay attention. He says, "Such is the grasping tendency of the human heart that it must have a something to lay hold of, and which, if wrested away without the substitution of another something in its place, would leave a void and a vacancy as painful to the mind as hunger is to the natural system. It may be dispossessed of one object or of any, but it cannot be desolated of all." So hear what he's saying there. He's saying it's just powerless for us to get rid of something else. We'll feel empty and hungry, and our hearts will jump to the next thing that we could begin to worship. This is who we are. But then he goes on to say there's a second way that we can work to eliminate idols in our life. Chalmers says that a better way to rid the heart of its love for idols, its love for the world, is to displace that love with a greater love. According to Chalmers, because we were created to worship, the only way to rid the heart of disordered loves is by the expulsive power of a new and greater affection. Let me explain what he means by this. Imagine you have a glass container, okay? And this glass container is open, and so it's full of air, and you've been given the job of removing all of the air out of that container. Right? Now picture that container is like the human heart, and the air that is in that is like these idols that we cling to and we worship, right? And so imagine our task is to get that. The first option we could do is we could kind of create some kind of seal and pump and try to pull out all of the air from that and create a vacuum within this container. But the reality is that the air is always going to be forcing its way back into this open container. So what Chalmers is saying is that there is a better way to do that, which is by displacing that with something greater, something larger, more significant and weightier. So for example, a better way to eliminate air from a container is to fill it with water or to fill it with sand. Right? Something that will fill it up and push everything else out, and then there's no more space for that air to come back in. And Chalmers is saying it is the exact same with our human heart. We need something greater than the love that we have for the idols in our lives to come in and dispel everything out, to push it out. He says this, the only way to dispossess the heart of an old affection is by the expulsive power of a new one. Now, of course, the question that we need to ask then is, what is that greater love? That greater object of affection that will dispel all other idols in our lives? Well, according to Chalmers, the greater love that must expel all other loves is the love of the triune God himself. And you're thinking, well, maybe, of course, that's obvious that God would be there. But listen to this, even more specifically, Chalmers is arguing that it is the love of God, the love of God dispels all these other loves when we come to see that God is actually our Father, and that through his Son Jesus, he has actually adopted us into his family and poured out his Spirit upon us. So even though we rightly should have no place there in the presence of God, he has made a place for us. He has welcomed those of us who are far from him to be brought near through the blood of Jesus. And this is the issue that so many of us face. If we're really honest, when we come to God, we see him as a distant father, or an unpleased or displeased father who is hesitant to love, who refrains from loving us and welcoming us. And so in our times of prayer and in our times in the Word, in our thinking, in our feeling throughout the day, we inevitably think that God is far from us. Chalmers is saying there is no power for transformation there, but when the grace of God truly sinks into our hearts, when it settles into every corner of our being, so that we know without a shadow of doubt that we are saved by grace and grace alone, Chalmers says there is no stopping the transformation that God will bring as a love for him fills up our life, and everything else gets pushed to the limits and gets ultimately pushed out of our lives completely. In essence, we could say it like this: idols are eliminated in our life as we come to behold the beauty of Jesus Christ in all of his fullness. And think about this for a minute. As Christians, as followers of Jesus, the only way for us to honor and obey the first word, "You shall have no other gods before me," is by adoring and worshiping and honoring Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who says that he has come to reveal the Father, that when we see him, we see who God actually is. Because the God we are called to worship alone is the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit. And friends, this is the message that we hear in the gospel. This is the good news that we hear in the gospel. Jesus Christ came to save sinners. Paul would go on to say, of whom I am the foremost, and I would echo that thought, of whom I am the foremost. And I want to say to you, church, that until that reality is the sweetest thing you know in the whole world, until the good news of Jesus becomes the most treasured news in all of the world, likely you will be powerless to fight against the ways that your heart wants to cling to and worship other false gods. But when you realize that God's grace is sufficient, when you come to realize all that you've been offered in Jesus Christ, all of the spiritual blessings that we have in him that come only by his grace, when we come to know these and embrace these things, what we'll find is our hearts being transformed to love God in a greater way than anything else we could love, so that all of those things eventually get pushed to the out and are expelled by a new and greater affection, the affection that we have for God in Jesus Christ. One of the ways that we learn to delight in this grace and to gaze upon the beauty of Jesus as a church that the New Testament commands us to is by participating in the Lord's table. Right? And so as we do this as a church, one of the things that we're doing is we're gathering to remember the way that Jesus gave his life for sinners like you and I, to remember the way that he's established a new covenant in his blood, and to say to not just ourselves, but to each other that we are a people of the grace of God. We are people of grace. That we stand here by no other means other than the fact that God has freely welcomed us. And so what we're going to do this morning is partake of the Lord's table together. And as we do this, I just want to ask, if you're here with us this morning and you have not clearly given your life to Jesus, if you've not said to God, God, I trust that the sacrifice of Jesus is sufficient for the forgiveness of my sins, and if you've not placed your life in his hands, then we just want to encourage you to watch as we participate and to not join us in this, as this is just a really significant moment that marks out the people of God together and the covenant that we have with God. So we just ask that you refrain from joining us, but if you are wanting to partake, and if your heart is in a place where you want to trust God, you can do that now and then join us as a member of the family of God. And so I want to take a second and pray for us as we prepare. And then what I want to do is just give us 10 to 30 seconds where we can just silently spend some time preparing our hearts before God in silence and asking God to reveal the ways in which we've maybe chased after idols, where we've worshiped false gods, and just allow him to call us back to worship of him alone. And then I'll come back up and we can partake of these things together. So pray with me, and then we'll have a moment of silence. Father, this morning we thank you for your word, Lord, and we thank you that what we're seeing here is, again, you laying down the path to true life. And Lord, you're calling us to worship you alone, not because you want to make life difficult for us, but because, Father, you know that you are God alone, and any other thing we worship will be destructive to us. So this morning, Father, we thank you for the blood of your Son, Jesus, who was given for us. And Father, I want to pray specifically if there's anyone here this morning struggling with the reality that you have saved us by your grace, and that because of Jesus, you look at us as righteous and as beloved. Father, I want to pray that that reality would seep into their hearts right now. Father, let us not hold on to our legalism, to our questions, but trust that what your word says about how you feel towards us now is true. And Father, I pray that as we partake of these things together, you would form us into a community of grace, a community of people who know that we are here by the grace of God alone and by no other, and that is the blood of Jesus that saves us. That you'd be honored and glorified in us. In Jesus' name we pray.